Hello, my name is Charlie Stark, and in this presentation I will be discussing Native Alaskan subsistence and climate change. The main focus of this presentation is how climate change is impacting subsistence practices and resources in Native Alaskan communities. Let's begin with a subsistence impact overview. Subsistence activities and resources have been a major element of Native Alaskan culture and survival for thousands of years. Traditional subsistence practices do not only encompass the actions of fishing, hunting, and gathering. For Native Alaskan cultures, there are also elements of respect, gratitude, and conservation. However, relatively recent changes in government oversight and control have greatly impacted access to subsistence practices, and the long history of neglect and abuse of Native Alaskans by the government has negatively affected the amount of trust that Native Alaskan communities are able to place in government-backed climate reports and mitigation guidance. While there is a large amount of climate change impact and mitigation information available from the government, traditional ecological knowledge holds significant value and insights based on centuries of traditionally acquired data. Next, we'll be discussing government and climate impacts. Since 1999, the state and federal governments have had considerable control over subsistence fishing and hunting in Alaska. While the state manages the subsistence fish and game boards, which are operated by biologists with advisory groups that are mostly made up of commercial and sports interests, the federal government operates the Subsistence Board, which consists of federal land and resource managers and is advised by regionally appointed council members from local communities. A major issue with so much government involvement is that the focus is on resource management, contrary to the native priority of resource preservation. Thomas Thornton acknowledged this distinction in 2001, writing, "The state concentrates exclusively on monitoring and controlling the physical aspects of subsistence, while native subsistence hunters and fishers engage in a wide variety of social and spiritual practices designed to preserve a moral, physical, and social order with non-humans that extends well beyond the material realm. As a consequence of this cultural and paradigmatic divide, a great deal of miscommunication and misunderstanding occurs between native and non-natives, not only about the meaning of subsistence, but also how it should be valued and protected." In discussing the effects of climate change on Native Alaskan communities, it's important to look at the data. In the most recent report from the Alaska Center for Climate Assessment and Policy, recent changes to Alaska's climate are highlighted. The report found that big fire seasons are becoming more frequent, which has contributed to migration disruptions for animals and decreases in what little predictability is associated with hunting. The report also addresses the fact that river breakup is happening earlier, affecting both hunting and fishing, and further limiting the time available to haul heavy loads on ice. Additionally, the report attributes increases in salmon die-off to warming water temperatures. And lastly, the report discusses ocean acidification, wherein carbon dioxide from the atmosphere is absorbed into the ocean at higher rates, which leads to a decrease in the water's pH. Decreased pH harms organisms that are sensitive to acidity, like petropods near the bottom of the food chain, and the life forms that rely on them, along with organisms that are higher on the food chain. Let's take a look at some of the current and potential climate strategies. In 2008, two programs, the Alaska Climate Change Impact Mitigation Program and the Coastal Impact Assistance Program, were created to offer technical assistance and funding to Alaskan communities to prepare impact assessments that, quote, characterize, diagnose, and project risks or impacts of environmental change on people and communities, end quote. Additionally, the Alaska Department of Fish and Game has been developing strategies to respond to climate impacts. The Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation has released 2 greenhouse gas emissions inventories, which detail the state's emissions from anthropogenic and natural sources since 2010. And the Department of Health and Social Services released a report on how climate change impacts health in 2018. Climate adaptation is another potential strategy that can be employed to prepare for future changes. As Dylan Sandler states, quote, climate adaptation aims to reduce vulnerability to climate change, end quote. While climate adaptation measures cannot reverse the current amount of damage, they can aid in the adjustment to current and expected circumstances. In discussing climate change impacts on Native Alaskan communities, it's important to take into consideration Native Alaskan perspectives. Following the Exxon Valdez oil disaster and a neglected nuclear waste site that was used by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in the 1980s, which compounded on decades of experimentation, child removal, and other cultural trauma, Native communities are rightfully resistant to trust the government to provide accurate and valid information concerning things that affect their well-being. Stransky raises the critical point that while assumptions lead white institutions to believe that Native villages are too lazy or ignorant to use the formal systems of disaster response and mitigation, thousands of years of hazard recognition and the acceptance of the variances in the behavior of natural forces are drivers of Native decision-making and reactions to hazards. Further, Calloway notes that social networks are lessening the impact of climate change through widespread sharing of resources. However, the continued impact of storm surges may result in the need for many Native communities to relocate. The familiarity and spiritual connections that Native communities have with their environments are part of their cultures and identities. Removing these communities from their environments can lead to feelings of helplessness and lack of control, which can result in negative psychological and social consequences, as well as a loss of cultural connection and identity. In conclusion, as climate change threatens the loss of access to subsistence practices and resources for Native Alaskans, communities are having to make difficult decisions. Differences between government and Native perceptions and priorities concerning culture, nature, and survival don't seem to be making that process any easier for anyone. The long history of mistreatment by the government has resulted in considerable distrust between Native communities and the reports and information that are being made available, and Native communities are being faced with weighing safety and survival against tradition and cultural identity. Listed here are the sources used in the making of this presentation. Thank you for watching, and take care.